Thanks for joining us for this episode of the all-new Insights Video Edition. I'm Sheila Fordson. And as you can see, we've got a brand new look and feel designed to give you a more personal viewing experience as we chat with NCCI's thought leaders. And we have two of them with us now, John Sinclair and Amelia Carroll, to discuss NCCI's latest research on medical inflation and workers' compensation medical costs. Medical inflation was identified as a front-of-mind concern in NCCI's recent annual survey of insurance executives. And John and Amelia are here to discuss NCCI's multi-part series on the topic. John and Amelia, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Doing well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So, medical inflation in workers' compensation has been moderate for the past decade or so, but it is now a top-of-mind concern for industry stakeholders. Can you tell us why that is?
Sure, Sheila. It starts with inflation in general being on the top of everyone's mind. Every time someone checks out at the grocery store, they're reminded of just how quickly that prices have risen. And add to this, over the last 20 years, medical inflation has typically always outpaced general inflation. So in workers' compensation, medical costs are the largest share of expenditure. So for our stakeholders, this was top of mind because there was significant uncertainty around how this inflationary environment would ultimately impact medical costs.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. And so what we've seen is that general inflation peaked in mid-2022 before coming back down. But during this period, medical inflation actually tracked lower than general inflation. So this was a reversal of what had typically been observed. Come January 2023, the latest general CPI number came in at 6.4%. Compare that to medical CPI in January, which was only about 3%. So how does this translate to workers' comp? This series evaluated workers' comp medical costs from 2012 to 2021 to understand how medical costs have changed. Over this time period, medical costs in workers' comp increased by about 2% per year on average. During this same time period, this was lower than medical inflation in general and significantly lower than those general CPI numbers you see in the headlines.
So it certainly makes sense that there would be increased interest in this topic based on what you've both just shared. And this series really takes a deep dive into some key aspects of inflation in workers' compensation medical costs. Let's start with part one, overall medical. Amelia, what are some key findings from that first report?
The first piece really explores how inflation impacts medical cost trends in workers' compensation, like you said. And across this series, a common theme is that the changes in the costs are going to be influenced by two things. First, the prices paid for medical services, and two, changes in the number and the mix of services, which we refer to as utilization. The report further reveals that hospital services have contributed the most to increases in medical costs, and second to that was physicians. Decreasing drug costs, on the other hand, helped mitigate some of the overall growth in medical.
And John, the second installment examines how different types of facility services contribute to countrywide and regional facility cost trends in workers' comp. What did that research reveal?
So Sheila, that research, we looked into in the second installment, the cost impacts across the different facility types. So there's three of those. That's hospital inpatient, hospital outpatient, and ambulatory surgical centers. And so what we saw was that facility costs actually contributed the most to the overall medical costs in workers' compensation. The increasing amount of payments per visit was the largest driver across all facility types. Within facilities, hospital outpatient actually grew the most and drove most of the increase we saw within medical costs. However, there was one mitigating factor that we saw a shift in where surgical services were taking place from an inpatient setting to an outpatient setting, which served to moderate some of that growth.
And so the most recent installment of this series was recently released on NCCI.com, and it covers physician services, which along with facility services really represent the bulk of medical expenditures in workers' compensation. What insights are presented in part 3 of this series?
In the most recent physician piece, the price and utilization are again presented as the main components of our changing costs. The report identifies that prices of physician services are the largest contributors to the physician cost increases. Of the different type of physician services, physical medicine is the most prominent contributor, and those costs have been growing at about 1.4% annually. Another thing is that fewer surgeries curbed the increase in the physical medicine utilization.
So this has been very insightful content that you've given us today, but there is a part 4 coming to this series as well. What can we expect in part 4? What are we covering there?
So part 4 will examine prescription drugs and see what type of impacts those have had on the trends we've seen. We're also going to be having at our 2023 Annual Insight Symposium a presentation in which we will examine changes in the types of injuries occurring and how those changes may be impacting the trends we've seen too. And this full series on medical inflation and workers' compensation is available on ncci.com in the Insights portal.
And registration is now open for NCCI's Annual Insight Symposium 2023 at ncci.com/AIS. And you can get real-time updates of NCCI's Insights articles in a few ways. Follow us on Twitter at NCCI for daily content. Subscribe right here to channel NCCI on YouTube and visit the Insights portal at ncci.com. I'm Sheila Fordson. Join us next time when we discuss the issues at the top of the workers' comp agenda from the source you trust.